A lot of people think about it as just the internet or all things social media, but to me, I take a very general approach. So it's anything you can get your hands on physically or digitally, free or paid, that's not confidential, like witness testimony or defense or government intelligence. So in some specific cases, we can find out potentially who was involved with the deportation of Ukrainian children.
Mykola Kuleba, CEO of Save Ukraine Rescue Fund. Just after the occupation of territories of Kherson and Kharkiv region, we recognized that it's a lot of children who've been abducted, who were deported, forcibly deported to Russia or Crimea, and we plan how we can return them to Ukraine.
Where those children are.
Ukrainian children sent to summer camps run by Russia and then never returned. Alla tells me every minute now counts. The children have been told they'll be put in care if their mums don't come for them. That means a grueling trip across thousands of miles from Ukraine deep into the country that's declared war on them.
What families they might be with through photos posted on social media or adoption websites is one source that we found, and other types of websites. So that's become incredibly useful for the organizations that are trying to find and return these children.
This is the Justice Decoder podcast. I'm Olivier Clavet, your host for this series. And together, we will dive into key thematic areas of international justice with experts from the Justice Rapid Response Roster. Today with us is Jenna Dolocek, a JRR Open-Source Investigator and human rights advocate. Jenna, thank you for being with us today.
Thank you so much for having me. I really appreciate it.
First of all, Jenna, what is OSINT expertise? What are we talking about here exactly, just to help situate our audience?
Yeah, so in the past 10 years, I've seen quite an evolution since I first became aware of what open source or OSINT is. A lot of people think about it as just the internet or all things social media, but to me, I take a very general approach. So it's anything you can get your hands on physically or digitally, free or paid, that's not confidential, like witness testimony or defense or government intelligence. So really, it's nothing new. We've been doing it forever, reading textbooks, journals, newspapers, and so on. The only new development is that information now exists in digital form on the internet. So it's learning to use software, tools, websites, programs to also capture this information as well and analyze it.
So specifically in Ukraine, Jenna, who are the organizations you're working with? What were they expecting? I know, for instance, you were working with this local organization based in Kyiv called the Media Initiative for Human Rights, correct?
So yes, that's correct. I did work with the Media Initiative for Human Rights, as well as other Ukrainian NGOs and entities.
And in more precisely, because we're going to be focusing on your work in Ukraine, why do we apply this kind of expertise in the context of Ukraine? Why is it useful? Maybe you can name a few examples of the work you've been involved with.
Absolutely. It can be really integral to investigations and later on in cases. So, sometimes all you have is testimony, which is great, but now we can back up corroborating those details with audio, photos, and videos that people have posted online, whether on social media or some other platform on the internet. And basically, we can use, or somebody talking in a video is informal testimony, essentially, that somebody posts online. So really detailed corroboration is really, really huge. But we can also find direct evidence or even exculpatory evidence, proving that something didn't happen and that somebody is not responsible. So in some specific cases, we can find out potentially who was involved with the deportation of Ukrainian children, where those children are, what families they might be with through photos posted on social media or adoption websites is one source that we found, and other types of websites. So that's become incredibly useful for the organizations that are trying to find and return these children. Another way is we can obviously, determine people's identities, maybe locations where they're based or where they've been, and not just for military operations, but we can determine people's rank when they got that rank, which helps us establish command responsibility. Who was giving orders, who was taking orders, who, where people were responsible within that essentially chain of conduct. We can also determine if maybe people are soldiers, for example, or even still alive, so they can face prosecution for crimes that they've committed. So their open source really is an absolute wealth of information, of potential evidence, and there's so many ways we can use it that it's really incredible. But it is currently being used in many cases, not just children, not just war crimes, but a lot of different facets. Sexual and gender-based violence, for example, is one. Conflict-related sexual violence is one.
Just to dive a bit deeper, I'm curious, you were saying that you can identify someone's rank through OSINT expertise. How do you do this? Like, how can you identify someone's rank based on photos on social media? Would it be like to identify, let's say, the symbol they have on their shoulder? Let's say it's a military officer, or how do you do that?
Yeah, insignia on uniforms is definitely one way to do it. That's quite an easy way. So that's always nice when we can find those types of photos. But another source that we actually used in a case is Russian news media. They might post an article that maybe, especially if it's maybe a small village or a town, that so-and-so was promoted to X rank. And so we can figure out potentially a date that they were promoted and what rank they were promoted to. And that helps us determine when certain conduct took place and their essentially type of command responsibility, whether they were the very top, mid-rank, lower level, something like that. But also we had a case with a deceased soldier where we did have photos of him, and his mother was very proud, posted a lot of photos so we could tell his rank. But he was also awarded a medal posthumously, and so that was one of the things that determined for us that he was indeed dead. And so obviously couldn't face prosecution. So yeah, news media is a big one for that. But there's military forums, a lot of military Telegram channels, and it's just a wealth of that kind of information.
Jenna, just to go back to the organization you work with in Ukraine in your recent deployments, could you please tell us a bit about them? What were the expectations? How are they working? Just so we have a better understanding of whom you were working with in Ukraine.
Yeah, so it was an NGO that was kind of more media investigation focused, more investigative journalism, not just hard like justice and accountability. So they have a bit more wiggle room, not exactly the same focus as some other NGOs, which is kind of nice. I always like the variety and the type of work and stuff that we're doing. So their focus was determining if high-ranking officials had any foreign assets. So we wanted to see if, there had been foreign travel recently, if they had any foreign property, or anything that could potentially make them eligible for sanctions for the conduct they had been involved in, if we're not able to sort of bring them to justice and hold a legal case. So they have a different sort of focus where they can use different tools such as sanctions to try and affect these people and stop this conduct. So that was definitely a new one for me, which was really interesting and also very, very challenging at the same time.
I can understand, because sometimes I guess there's just no information to be found sometimes on people, right? Do you want to dive a bit more into that? Because, we talked about this, and I think it could be quite interesting for our folks listening.
Yeah. So in open source, it's definitely hard to tell sometimes whether the information simply doesn't exist, or if maybe these people just don't have foreign assets that we can identify, or if for whatever reason we are just not able to find that information. And that makes open source investigation extremely challenging, sometimes very discouraging, and sometimes we never get that answer, frankly. So the organization I worked with, they had already done as much investigation as they could. So then they wanted to bring in an expert to see if either anything else could be found or if they had done everything possible. So our conclusion that was essentially we had all done everything we could We couldn't find additional information, but we don't know the answer of if it doesn't exist or if we just can't access it. So we took it as far as we could, essentially, and it's kind of up to the organization then what they want to do from there.
Jenna, what are some of the reasons you cannot find certain information on the internet? Is it linked, for instance, to the age of the person you might be investigating, considering that there is a higher propensity of younger folks using social media, for instance, and that we're noticing sort of the opposite trend for more senior individuals? Is it part of the reason you can't find certain information?
Absolutely. I definitely think that was a reason in this case, because the individuals we were looking at were probably at least 40s, if not averaged 50s or 60s. So they're quite higher up. And that generation just already doesn't use, the internet and social media that much anyway. But I think they're much more disciplined than the younger generations and soldiers who put up, absolutely everything online. So that was already a challenge there, was the age demographic. And then after that, it's, I think, a question of just where would that information exist? So I looked at property registries in numerous countries to try and search names or any other information we had. Sometimes we have passport numbers, tax numbers, really important information that can help us, gain access to information like that. But sometimes it's just not there. Either, again, they don't have property, so they're not going to be found in a registry, or they frankly don't make enough money to have that kind of property, so that's not going to exist. Or, they can potentially use different names. They could have fake documents. Or a lot of times people put things in their family's names, their spouse's names, children's names. But we had that information as well, and I didn't find anything in their names either. So it can really be a range of reasons. And so that's one reason why open source investigation is so tedious, is you have to check everything. And it's a lot of information and it can take a long time.
Jenna, when you start an investigative process with whatever organization, how do you approach this? Do you start by, drafting a strategy to actually understand what you're looking for, where you're going? How does it work at the very initial stage of an investigative process in relation to your expertise?
Yeah, the organization typically gives me everything they've already done up to that point. And so I review everything they did, everything they found. And they usually also have either a list of questions or gaps, or that's something we discuss in meetings, is either something they couldn't access or they didn't know how, or I can see those gaps when I'm going through the information that they give me and what they've already found, what they haven't found. So sometimes it makes it self-evident, sometimes not. From there, then, coupled with what they're asking for or what they're wanting to find, then I sort of take a step back and assess something that I believe it was Dr. Alexa Koenig at Berkeley came up with, which was called the digital information landscape.
This is Alexa Koenig, co-faculty director of UC Berkeley's Human Rights Center at a 2021 conference at Dartmouth University.
So we pulled together a series of 4 workshops, and you can see the reports up on this screen, to bring together technologists with human rights advocacy groups and researchers, with investigators from the International Criminal Court, the former Yugoslavia Tribunal, that from the former Rwanda, Lebanon, etc., to talk about how new forms of fact-finding were being made possible by the advent of these new and emerging technologies. We were looking at the potential for the use of big data analytics, satellite imagery, which had suddenly become commercially available and was no longer just in the purview of governments. Also, this information that was rapidly proliferating, where people were frantically sending to the International Criminal Court the videos and the photographs that they were taking, alleging war crimes and other abuses. The problem was the prosecutors were drowning now in these videos and these photographs. And the kinds of videos and photographs they were being sent was the stuff that people, of course, on the ground care about. It was the actual body of their loved one, or it was the site of the bomb attack. But what the prosecutors and investigators really needed was not more proof that a crime had taken place. What they needed was the lead information that would get them to other sources of evidence, like the witnesses who could tell them what had happened, or the physical evidence, like the soil samples or the DNA tests that might give some additional evidence. They also needed the linkage evidence. Linkage evidence is the information that ties the on-the-ground atrocity, so the killing or the rape, to the highest level perpetrator, the commander who is responsible for what took place. Because at places like the International Criminal Court, they are mandated to only go after that top person, and sometimes creating that chain, that network, is really quite challenging. But what new opportunities do social networks provide, if not to provide some of the connections between people? And so many of us began asking, can we leverage the network of relationships that are captured in these digital spaces to begin to draw the connections of who likely did what to whom, where, when, and how?
And so they created a really helpful assessment tool, which basically there's, multiple questions, which is what country are we focusing on? Is it an urban area, a rural area? Is it both? What social media platforms are popular in that country or with certain demographics? Are we looking at young people? Are we looking at older people? Even, cell phone carriers, internet providers, things like that. What is the connectivity rate among that population? And we can even break that down by age, by gender, economic class, things like that. And so that gives us a better idea of where information might be. So I always look at those most popular platforms. So which for Russia largely will be vKontakte, which is basically Russian Facebook, as people explain it. Odnoklasniki, or called OK, which is like a school. You can put your high school, your university, and connect with classmates that way. And then, of course, Facebook, Twitter, and then Telegram is usually the next biggest one. So we tend to target then our searches on those platforms. But I also do general internet searches as well, because we might want to find local Russian media about either these individuals or, events, things like that. And then from there, when I kind of have my websites, my social media databases, things like that, I come up with my keywords, my search strings, which will always be a combination of usually English, Russian, and Ukrainian, names, birthdays, emails, phone numbers, locations, either the town where they work or where they were known to be stationed or something like that, if it's military or something else, and other helpful keywords, maybe their rank, slang terminology is another really big one, is knowing the types of language that's being used to talk about something. So call signs are very common within the military. So if we have a call sign, we can search that, or we have their name and we can maybe find their call sign out that way. Or when it comes to sexual violence, there's a lot of kind of what we call coded language used. So we need to know the phrases and words that people use when they're referring to sexual violence. So a lot of times people don't use the word rape, obviously. So we have to know what other words are used. Somebody forced themselves on me, or, I had to do this, things like that. And then knowing that in those local languages as well. So it's really taking a step back, figuring out where information might be, but also being willing to look in other places.
Jenna, you talked about tools. That's quite interesting, because there's, it's quite of a new field. I mean, correct me if I'm wrong, but the way we use OSINT now in investigative work is quite a nascent. There's still so much to be done and so much policy or guidelines to be developed. How are we with this? Like in terms of expert manuals, practitioners' guidelines, is there enough out there? Do we need to keep developing it? What's the situation in that regard?
Yeah, there's definitely been a huge change of this, again, over the past 10 years. When I first started, I was at the University of Essex at the Human Rights Center, a part of Amnesty International's Digital Verification Corps, and I was part of the very first cohort of that program. And our output was called the Introductory Guide to Open Source Intelligence and Digital Verification. And that was one of the very first guides out there for what we were doing specifically for human rights and humanitarian investigations. So there wasn't much when I first started. There was a little bit, here and there, but nothing coherent. And so recently, the Berkeley Protocol was kind of one of the first major ones for the field, which came out a few years ago now. And it's a really, really excellent foundation, and we are building on it from there, which is great. But I always go back and forth on whether or not we should have just general guidelines like Berkeley or much more granular guidelines, because I think we could potentially lose out if we make things too restrictive. But at the same time, we also don't want to keep it so general that things aren't being done in a coherent, universal way. So I think, the field is kind of figuring that out. But there's also existing guidelines for more defense and intelligence. So we could sort of use that as a basis. And there is good guidance in there, even though it's not tailored to our use. So we do have to be a little careful with those. And a lot of organizations have their own internal policies, which is great. But I think we need to be careful with internal policies, but make sure that they are in line with some of those wider guidelines like Berkeley Protocol or also the Leiden guidelines. So the Leiden guidelines, which gets a lot more granular, but it really focuses on international criminal court practices, policies, and cases, which is really, really useful. So they kind of go almost sort of policy by policy when it comes to evidence, and then talk about what they refer to as digitally derived evidence within that. So it doesn't focus on social media directly, but it does talk about photos, videos, and satellite imagery. So there's still a good amount of useful information in there. Yvonne McDermott-Rees of the True Project out of Swansea University. She has created a database with cases that have used open source content. And it also includes like what worked, what didn't work, or what issues there were with it. So that's incredible. That's an incredibly useful resource, which also kind of shows us the evolution of open source within actual legal cases. And then she recently published a book on the use and types of evidence in international courts, which had a small section on electronic evidence, but she'll be publishing another book which is focusing on open source evidence in the future. So definitely want to keep an eye out for that. But there's definitely a lot of work being done in this space, and I think it's going in the right direction, and we've got a really good foundation.
Jenna, looking forward, I mean, in this short amount of time that we had together, you touched on the many applications of OSINT expertise and how it can help, further justice and accountability processes. I'm wondering, is there anything that, our listeners, states, policymakers, is there anything they can do to help mainstream the reliance and the utilization of this type of expertise for this kind of work?
Yeah, I think, again, keeping up with a lot of the guidelines that have come out and paying attention to the best practices, but also those cases on what did or didn't work is vital to using this type of information in the justice and accountability arena. I think one sort of blind spot that is being filled, we are moving in the right direction, is with sexual and gender-based violence, conflict-related sexual violence. There's a huge, not just misunderstanding, but also just knowledge gap within not just the open source field, but justice and accountability in general. We've seen that time and time again in decisions. But there are guidelines on that that have been published and are being further developed. Obviously the Murad Code was huge. And then we also now have a next step, which is documenting sexual violence in open source investigation. So the education and the training is happening, which is excellent. But I think it's still, that one's even almost a little slower to be adopted than other stuff. And I think it's just because of the general societal and cultural hesitancy to deal with sexual violence in general. But like I said, it is moving in the right direction. So I think as long as organizations and any, sort of justice actors just keep up with the developments, which do change rapidly. I will grant them that it is hard, but just keeping up to date on the developments and best practices. I really think is all we can do, and we just try our best and learn from our mistakes.
Jenna, this was a real pleasure. This was too short. I would have liked to continue for at least an hour with you. So thank you so much for your time. It's been great, and I think our auditors also enjoyed it as well. Thank you, Jenna.
Yeah, thank you so much for having me.
And special thanks to our listeners. This was our second episode of a series of conversations with Justice Rapid Response experts discussing current challenges in the sector of justice and accountability to identify solutions to help victims and survivors seek justice. In our next episode, we will move to the Gambia on the western coast of Africa to touch on the country's transitional justice process and the challenges and opportunities it currently faces. Thank you. This episode was made possible thanks to the support of the Netherlands Ministry of Foreign Affairs. The Justice Decoder podcast is a Justice Rapid Response project, directed and edited by Cesar Rojas Angel, hosted by me, Olivier Clavet. Audio post-production by Eloisa Arcila at Sinsonte Studio.